Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Office of the Chief Scientist Seminar Series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Glenn Mack, and I'm the Director of Science Advice, Reporting, and Partnerships with the OCS and your host for today's seminar. Our regular host is away on vacation, but he'll be back in a month. On behalf of the entire OCS team, I welcome you and thank you for joining us today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that today we are broadcasting throughout Alberta and beyond on traditional lands and gathering places for Treaties 4, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, and Treaty 10, and of course the homeland of the Métis peoples. Wherever you find yourself today, I encourage you to recognize and acknowledge the shared relationship that the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have with the land upon which we all live, work, learn, and play. Today marks a significant milestone in the OCS Science Seminar Series, as it is our 100th seminar we've hosted. From talks on large mammals to the development of microsensors for air quality monitoring and most topics in between, we hope you found these opportunities to learn from our renowned experts. These science seminars provide an opportunity for us to get together to exchange knowledge on interesting science happening across Alberta in an open, learning, respectful, and sharing environment. The hope is that through our dialogue today, we're able to improve our awareness and understanding and put this knowledge into practice to support evidence-informed decision-making wherever that occurs. To help maintain our call quality today, your video and audio has been disabled. However, you can enter your questions or any comments in the chat at any time during the presentation, or even, of course, after the presentation. After the presentation has concluded, I'll read out the questions for the speaker to answer. Today, we are welcoming Paul Jones, who will be presenting a talk entitled Moving with Intent, Not Just Speed, Understanding Connectivity in the Modern Landscape. Paul is a senior biologist with the Alberta Conservation Association, and as many of you know, it's a nonprofit, non-government registered charity, largely funded by Alberta's hunters and anglers. Paul has a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Lethbridge and a Master's of Science degree from the University of Alberta. He's been working for ACA for 26 years and is focused on studying pronghorns for the majority of this time. He has co-authored over 30 publications, including peer-reviewed papers and book chapters on pronghorn. He's also the co-author on the latest version of the Pronghorn Management Guidelines and a Pronghorn Bibliography. In 2024, Paul was honored with the Berendo Award, which recognizes remarkable contributions to the pronghorn ecology and management. He is the youngest and first Canadian to win the award. So it is a true pleasure to have Paul join us today. So with that, Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. And it looks like I think we should be good. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so kind of just a quick outline for the presentation today so people can follow around. I'm going to do a little bit of a quick introduction to the species, the pronghorn. I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. I mean, I could spend my whole time talking about pronghorn and why they're so cool of a species. But instead, I'm just going to focus on their ability to move and to move fast. And then I'm going to transition into some of the historic work that I've done on pronghorn with my partners starting back in 2003, and then transfer into connectivity or the new project that we've started and some of the initial results that we've already started to see based on this new project. So a couple names that pronghorn go by are speed goat or prairie ghost, which you can kind of see here, these animals sort of fading out on the prairie landscape. The nicknames for pronghorn. So they are pronghorn, they're not antelope. That's kind of one of the misnomers of being considered related to the antelope of Africa, and that sort of prevailed today from the time when Lewis and Clark named them as sort of antelope. But they are in fact pronghorn, and they're not related to the antelope of Africa. They're actually more genetically related to the giraffe. So as my friend and colleague, Rich Gonzalez says, pronghorn are not antelope. So they are actually a prairie species. This is kind of their distribution across North America. They're an endemic North American species, meaning they're only found here in North America. And their historic range is this sort of black, dark black outline here. You can see they range basically all the way from the southern US, Texas, and Arizona, New Mexico, and into Mexico, all the way up through the Great Plains and into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and at one point there was pronghorn in Manitoba as well, but they're pretty much extirpated now from Manitoba. And then they occupy kind of 7 major vegetation classes, sort of the hot desert down in the south. And then as you kind of move up through the cold deserts and the woodlands and the tall grass prairies of North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas, and then the short grass prairies of sort of Montana, part of Wyoming, and then into Alberta and Saskatchewan. And this kind of gives you an idea of the different habitat they occupy. So this picture is actually taken in Saskatchewan, which would be sort of the short grass prairie. Then this picture here in Wyoming, where they cohabit with bison on the plains, and then the sort of desert habitat down in Mexico. But one of the key features of the habitat that you see in all of these pictures is it's open landscape. So they evolved on the open landscape. Once in a while, you'll see them in treed environments, but for the most part, they're treeless native prairie species. And they're built for speed. That's kind of one of the things that people sort of know about them. They can reach a speed of up to 100 kilometers an hour when they run full out. And that's kind of what amazes people is and why they're sort of called built for speed. So a study back in the 1974 by Tom McKean and Ben Walker, they did a comparison of the pronghorn and a regular goat, domestic goat, which is not really a fast runner, but they're of similar size. And one of the things they found was the heart in the pronghorn was about twice the size of that of the goat. They had 50% more blood and 60% more hemoglobin, plus 33% more red blood cells. And their airway had about half the resistance of that of a goat because it's about the size of a vacuum clean hoser. And these are all important features because it allows the pronghorn to get oxygen into those running muscles. Essentially, a pronghorn's VO2, sort of the measure of oxygen consumption, far exceeds that would be predicted for a 100-pound animal. And then they also have these long, skinny legs, which enables them to generate speed when they're running. And it's but that bone structure doesn't allow them to sort of paw through snow. They're great for running, but not for pawing during the wintertime. And the reason why they're so fast is because they evolved in the prairies when North America had a cheetah. So they're basically adapted for a predator that no longer persists in North America. And as the colleague Dr. Byers so aptly called them there, the pronghorn are the ghosts of predator past. But one of the things that really amazes me is not necessarily their speed and being able to run at 100 kilometers an hour or drop down and run at 65 kilometers an hour for like 10 minutes straight. It's their ability to move long distances in a very short time when they need to. And this sort of really became evident when we sort of moved and started our historic project back in 2003. So in 2003, ACA partnered with the University of Calgary and Alberta Fish and Wildlife to start a GPS collar study here in Alberta. And then basically based on the movements that we saw, even in the first year, how amazed we were, it kind of led to a bigger study that involved Saskatchewan Environment and Resource Management and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. And I'll kind of get into the bigger study area here in a little bit. But when we first started our study, the reason why kind of behind it is there was anecdotal information that pronghorn were switching their habitat selection or resource selection and starting to use croplands more and more and even staying in those croplands year round. So how we designed the original study is we planned on doing 3 years of captures, and we would capture animals in a mixture of kind of cropland, animals that were completely in agricultural land, and then animals that were completely in native land. And we would do this over 3 years, but what we did is we would move north. So the collars would drop off after the first year, we refurbished them and then redeployed the same collars moving north. in their study area. And the same thing, the collars would stay on for about 52 weeks or a year, drop off, refurbish, and then we move to our third year study area. So that was kind of the idea behind the study. But this gives you an idea of that data that we actually collected. So just to kind of orientate people, the dark green here is native prairie. The sort of tannish area here are agricultural lands. The yellowish areas you see here are more tame pasture. And what you're seeing here is basically a scatter plot of over 100,000 relocations on 60 individuals over the 3 years. And as you can kind of see, we did see some, unique habitat animals using cropland, animals in the native, and animals that kind of moved in between the native and agricultural lands. But you can quickly see how much movement we're seeing animals. Like we're seeing animals that are spending significant amount of time that were collared in Alberta moving into Saskatchewan, and also significant amount of time moving south into Montana. And what you don't really see on this is one of our biggest movers was collared kind of down in this area here. And she moved over 400 kilometers in a 3-month period during her spring migration, crossed the Trans-Canada Highway, moved up through Suffield, and then did this. This is her movement here near Macklin, Saskatchewan, into Saskatchewan, and then decided to come back during the fawning period into this area here, fawned, and then decided, we're not sure if she had her fawn successfully or not, but ended up moving and summering in Saskatchewan before returning the following fall and dropping her collar the following December on Suffield. So in total, she did over 800 kilometers in just about a 52-week period, including 400 kilometers during her spring migration. So it really kind of highlighted to us that, our Alberta population is interconnected with those in Saskatchewan and those in Montana. So it led to the bigger project with Montana and Saskatchewan called the Northern Sagebrush Steppe. And I'll just kind of introduce you. So this dark black outline is sort of our new study area that happened basically after the first year of data collection. So this time it's the yellow is the native prairie and the green is sort of your agricultural cropland, and then the kind of darker orangey tan here is tame pasture. And then just to orientate people, we got the city of Medicine Hat, the city of Swift Current, CFB Suffield. And then on the Montana side, they call this the Highline region, basically going from Shelby along Highway 2 through Havre, Malta, and Glasgow. So when we were done our data collection in Alberta, which happened in 2003 to 2007, we refurbished those collars and purchased additional collars, and they were put out on animals in Saskatchewan and in Montana. So then they collected data from 2008 through 2010, 2011. And one of the things we found out through the work of Dr. Andrew Jakes, who was a PhD student at the time at the University of Calgary on the project, was about 45% of our collared animals were considered residents and 55% were considered migratory. And just to kind of give you an idea of the sort of migration metrics. So spring migration usually occurred between March 22nd and April 10th. So we're basically right in the middle of it right now. And the fall migration occurred October 31st through November 10th. Spring migration distance averaged 162 kilometers, with animals in Alberta on average moving about 37 kilometers more than those that were collared in Saskatchewan and Montana. Fall migration was a little bit shorter at 108 kilometers. And again, Alberta animals moved further, on average 52.5 kilometers more than those that were collared in Saskatchewan and Montana. So you can kind of see the pronghorn in Alberta are making some of the longest year-round movements for the species in total. And then from that, Dr. Jakes built a connectivity sort of model for the Northern Sagebrush Steppe. And then I took sort of his models that were at sort of a fine scale and then produced this sort of connectivity map that sort of highlights the major migration pathways or connectivity corridors. And you can kind of see, in Alberta, the main one is moving from south, that many berries country where we have native prairie, up across the Trans-Canada and into sort of CFB Suffield area, and animals on Suffield as well moving sort of north during the spring and then returning in the summer. And then on the Montana, Saskatchewan side, we have animals moving back and forth between Saskatchewan into Montana and vice versa in the spring, coming back into Saskatchewan. And then he was also able to model that we had connectivity across the Trans-Canada. But I'll talk about this map a little bit later on of why my arrows don't go across. And then one of the other things that we also was able to document is these animals' ability to make what we call facultative movements. So this usually occurs for the most part during the wintertime. So they've already done their sort of fall migration if they're going to do it, or if they're resident, they're sort of on their winter range. And then because of the snow conditions, they make these facultative movements trying to find better conditions. So I'm kind of just going to run through an example of what we saw in terms of a facultative movement. So this is Pronghorn P169. She was collared in 2010, sort of here in Montana. That was kind of a winter range, and she did a little bit movement sort of up. And then in the spring on March 22nd, between March 22nd and April 10th, she did a big migration north. And you can kind of see it here, moving slowly into Saskatchewan. And then she summered here in Saskatchewan between April 11th and October 31st, 2010. Then in the fall, so starting sort of October 31st and going through November 10th, she was kind of still in Saskatchewan, kind of in this area here. Acting a little bit like a resident, and then she starts moving. So she did, she moved to her winter range. She was kind of a late one, November 11th to December 22nd, which happened to be about 10 kilometers from where she had wintered the year before. So this kind of straight line distance kind of give you an idea is 170 kilometers in distance. And then, yeah. And then she starts moving again at the end of December. And you can sort of see here this huge movement that she makes, close to almost 200 kilometers. And she actually left the study area. And that's in response to winter snowstorms. That winter of 2010, 2011 was, I think Montana recorded it as the 1 in 100th year snow event. What to get through it. You can see she moved a huge amount of distance. And unfortunately, we don't know what happened to her because she ended up dropping her collar down in this area here. So we don't know if she survived, and we don't know if she actually moved back into the study area or even back into Saskatchewan. But this kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that happens when pronghorn can't move, especially during these facultative movements or migrations during wintertime. So this picture here at the top, these are animals from Saskatchewan. I took this picture on a trip back from Regina along the Trans-Canada Highway where they'd been piled up. And you can see they're in poor shape. You can see like on this box here, his hips are very protruding. So he has lost a lot of his body mass and in all likely didn't survive the winter. And then this is an example from newspaper in Montana of an animal trying to move during that 2010, 2011 winter where she's basically exhausted and is up to the snow, up to basically her snout and covering her neck. And then the other one is a lot of times during these movements, they'll find railway tracks and they get up on the railway tracks because they're sort of the snow-free areas. And then when the train comes along, they just believe that they can outrun the train, which never ends well. We have lots of mortalities associated with train wrecks, including during that winter of 2010, 2011, where one train hit and killed over 200 pronghorn in Montana, including one of our collared animals. So we were also able to document differences in survival rates. So migratory pronghorn had a 7% higher predicted survival rate compared to resident animals. And then we also were able to demonstrate that survival as road density increases and fence density increases, the chances of survival also decreases. And partly this is because of sort of indirect effects of, trapping animals in areas that they don't want to be. So kind of some of the take-home messages that we took from the original study, and I always kind of say is you sort of answer one question and then generate additional questions. And in this case, we sort of had two additional questions that we sort of generated from the original study. The first one is this sort of pinch area around the city of Medicine Hat where animals migrated. So, and as animals are moving, whether it's north or south to north, the things they have to deal with is they have to cross fences. And for pronghorn, fences are a little bit of a barrier because they typically do not jump. They crawl underneath, which is sort of an evolutionary behavior of growing up on the prairies where there weren't fences. And then when European settlers started putting up fences, they adapted to them by crawling underneath. So if the bottom wire is too low, that fence becomes a complete barrier to pronghorn movement. So they have to deal with fences trying to cross getting across the Trans-Canada. In addition, we have 4 lanes of traffic and a wide meridian with the fences on both sides and high-speed traffic going through that area. So it slows down their movement. And that example I gave of P3 that made that huge movement, she actually spent 3 days moving back and forth on the south side of the Trans-Canada Highway before she successfully crossed. And then when she gets across the Trans-Canada Highway, she'll hit another fence and then a set of railway tracks, and then the 4th fence on the other side of the railway tracks. So this is kind of a key linkage or pinch point area for pronghorn during their migration. And then the other question that came out of this was this idea that there's connectivity across the Trans-Canada Highway in Saskatchewan. So Dr. Jakes, through his modeling exercise, these arrows actually connect, and he suggested that there is connectivity across the Trans-Canada Highway. But again, that was based on a modeling exercise, and in fact, there was never any collared pronghorn on the north side of the highway. All of the collared pronghorn were, animals that were collared in Montana or Saskatchewan that moved. And we did have some animals that moved within 5 kilometers of the Trans-Canada Highway, but never actually crossed. So then the question in my mind has always been, is there actually connectivity across the Trans-Canada Highway in Saskatchewan? And then it also kind of brought to my mind too is these animals that are doing this kind of southwest movement, mostly in the fall and then reverse in the spring, are these animals moving into Alberta because they already know that they can't get across the Trans-Canada, there's no connectivity, so they're doing the best approach is moving to Alberta and utilizing our habitat in the wintertime. So it's sort of to address that first question, the pinch point along the Trans-Canada Highway, and in some ways also the Saskatchewan connectivity. ACA partnered with Mustakish initially, and then Canadian Wildlife Federation came on as a partner as well to launch Pronghorn Crossing back in 2006. And basically, we developed a phone app that allowed citizen scientists or members of the general public, as well as myself and other biologists, to record sightings of pronghorn between Brooks, Alberta, and Swift Current, Saskatchewan. And when they're recording these observations, they can record whether the animal was crossing the highway, was dead along the highway, or was staging along the Trans-Canada Highway. And just to kind of give you some of the stats, we had 275 participants, 419 pronghorn observations, of which almost 82% were animals adjacent to the road, 11% were classified as unknown. They must have left that blank. About 9% were crossing, and 2.5% were recorded as mortalities. So then we took that data after 3 years of collection and kind of ran an analysis to look where the hot spots of where we are seeing pronghorn. And we combined the pronghorn crossing data along with Dr. Jakes' connectivity model and then data from the animal vehicle collision database to identify basically 16 sort of priority spots of where we think pronghorn are crossing and where they would benefit from sort of some road mitigation at these sites. And you can sort of see them here. The red ones are what we kind of eventually classified as a more of our high priority sites. So 4 in Alberta and 3 in Saskatchewan. But also one of the interesting facts that kind of came from that analysis is that the pronghorn mitigation sites had poor overlap with the animal vehicle collision data. And that's because sort of that data is skewed really to deer collisions, and that it appeared sort of that deer were crossing at slightly different sites than the pronghorn. And that Yeah, even though we did have a few sites, that were close proximity for deer crossing as well as pronghorn crossing, for the most part, they were separate. So we've started building a business case to look at a road mitigation system along the Trans-Canada Highway between sort of Brooks and Swift Current that would include sort of overpasses and underpasses. And as part of this business case, we've just started now to kind of build a more biodiversity business case. So we've actually put up trail cameras, and in the spring we'll be putting out again AIU units to document other species that use these areas. And these are sort of some of the preliminary results from last fall/winters at the site. So we kind of narrowed it down to only six sites, 3 in Alberta and 3 in Saskatchewan. But this kind of gives you an idea of what's using the site. So Suffield West, we have pronghorn, white-tailed deer, coyotes, and badgers been recorded at these sites. For the Dunmore site, we've got badgers, coyotes, pronghorn, foxes, and whitetail. And then the Walsh site, coyote, pronghorn, and then this is the mule deer using that site. Maple Creek, coyotes, pronghorn, and foxes. Piapot, we have actually documented moose using that site. Deer, pronghorn, and coyotes again. And then the Tompkins site, we have basically a suite of different things. So yeah, badger, actually raccoon, coyotes, pronghorn, skunks, foxes, and both deer species using that. So we're seeing that these proposed sites for pronghorn will have additional benefits for other species as well. I mean, and there are cases where road mitigation systems have been put in place, and specifically for pronghorn. I'll just kind of highlight this one called the Path of the Pronghorn. So the Path of the Pronghorn was sort of documented back in the early 2000s, around the same time we were doing our work. And it's a historical pronghorn migration where roughly 300 to 400 pronghorn every year, they summer up in Grand Teton National Park area, and then they do this big migration south into the Pinedale Upper Green River area. And they go through what they call the funnel area, and specifically Trappers Point. And at Trappers Point, the area is roughly about 1 kilometer or 2 wide. That's just it, where all the animals, all 300 to 400, cross at this one site. So the Transportation Commission, they actually allocated nearly $10 billion to build 2 wildlife overpasses for pronghorn and 6 underpasses for mule deer in this area to allow animals to cross safely. And they concluded that within the first year alone, the project has reduced wildlife vehicle collisions by over 85%, which is amazing. And I do know some of the colleagues that were working on this site, even before the overpasses were finalized, they had pronghorn using them. They said there was the construction workers were having lunch on the side of a hill, and they watched about 100 pronghorn come down and find the pre-constructed crossing site and crossed at it. So that, I mean, that's great if we can implement a system like that in Alberta, but it's all good and fine as long as pronghorn in Alberta can still get to the highway. So we've actually changed this landscape quite a bit since our initial work. I was actually amazed at how much has changed. So I took that connectivity map and I've just zoomed into that area around Medicine Hat. So they still have to deal with fences. They still have to crawl under the fences to get to this area, whether you're looking broad scale, like on the landscape, or up close to the Trans-Canada Highway. And then they still have to deal with the 4 lanes of traffic, which I'm assuming is likely increasing. The way everything is going these days, there's likely more traffic on that highway. And then this is the bypass route that goes around Medicine Hat from Highway 3 to the Trans-Canada. And there's been a significant amount of industrial and urban development along there. And I took this picture. You can kind of see it here, but it's got a chain link fence all around it. This is a co-op farm implementation store. And then on the other side is actually a farm mechanic with another chain link fence around his place. And this is roughly where the one pronghorn actually crossed that led to that migration corridor on that side. So, you know, we may be looking at this kind of crossing site to the west of Medicine Hat, may be actually lost already. And then we have the new players on the landscape. So renewable energy. So you can sort of see here within and on either side of the migration pathway, wind energy being developed, and then also solar energy being developed in and along and on the either side of the corridor. So then it kind of begs the question now that sort of our original study was done and we've changed and added greatly to the human footprint of whether this migration corridor is still intact and whether it's still functional. And I'm going to kind of talk to, you can sort of see here, but talk to the two major players that are new on the landscape. I just kind of want to give some parameters around that and what impacts it may be having on pronghorn. I'm going to start with solar farms and then move to wind energy. So there's only been so far one published study on the impacts of solar farms on pronghorn, and that was conducted by one of my colleagues, Hall Sawyer, with West Consulting in Wyoming. And Hall graciously shared these images with me and the story for me to present here. So what you see here in panel A on the left, so these are GPS locations of resident pronghorn that were using this area before the Sweetwater solar facility, which is this area here, was built. And as you can see, they've got pretty good distribution through that area. And then on the left, on the right, panel B is GPS locations of pronghorn after the facility was built. And there's a lot more locations afterwards, because I think partly, if I remember right, he also had some migratory animals that made facultative movements and moved into this area. But it's not too surprising that you see no use of the area that was once accessible to them, the saltwater facility, because it has a chain link fence all around it. So basically, there's been a direct loss of 2.3 square kilometers of habitat based on this facility being built, which was basically what he concluded was about 10 to 12% the size of the average pronghorn winter and summer core area in this area. But then what was more concerning to him and what was a bit of a surprise is when he modeled the high habitat value from this data, how much was lost. So again, on the left here is pre-construction. You can sort of see here where animals were using, and this would be sort of the high habitat value in here, and how it dramatically changes. There was approximately a 40% indirect habitat loss in this area as a result of this one facility. And it's basically just because pronghorn eventually learned that there was a chain link fence that they couldn't move through, and they sort of distanced themselves from that area. Even though that there was sort of low levels of traffic and human disturbance associated with the facility, there was still a 40% loss of habitat. And then in terms of wind turbines and wind farms, there's really only been sort of 4 studies that have looked at the impacts to pronghorn, but really the 4 studies have been in 2 study areas. So kind of the first one, this is sort of the evidence they found, is that there was some evidence of avoidance and displacement by pronghorn in relationship to the wind turbines. They avoided selecting stopover sites during migration in the vicinity of wind turbines. And there was also sort of reduced fidelity to their migration routes relative to the turbines that were under construction. And they also picked up their speed when they were moving through these areas that had turbines. Yet there was not an impact on winter survival, which in some ways I'm not surprised, because these were sort of short-term studies, just 2-year studies, 3-year studies. So it may not have been long enough to detect an impact on survival. But again, we're starting to kind of look at this in a bigger way. The pronghorn workshop was last summer, and kind of one of the big discussions around there was developing sort of management guides as it relates to wind energy and initiating new studies to look at the impacts on pronghorn. So one of the questions that comes to my mind is, we've created a bigger footprint in Alberta. We don't know if there's connectivity in Saskatchewan. What would happen if we actually flipped that and we had basically 100% resident animals and no migrants because they can't move through this area? What would be the lasting impacts to the populations in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, and Montana for that matter? So we've actually, ACA, and we're partnered kind of with the University of Calgary, have initiated a new project where we've got some sort of three major questions. So the first one is, have migration movement pathways and connectivity changed? And we're kind of looking at this at a core scale. So, are they able to move from that Many Berries area across the Trans-Canada Highway up into the Suffield area and north and back and forth, as well as a fine scale. So what happens when they actually hit the Trans-Canada? How often do they move back and forth? How many days do they spend trying to get across the Trans-Canada? Or is it completely permeable and they're able to move across? I sort of doubt that based on the initial study. Or do they actually hit the Trans-Canada and aren't able to cross anymore and turn around and move back to where they were wintering the year before? And the second one is, how are the migration routes and resource selection patterns influenced by infrastructure and linear features? So looking at, how is, resource selection and movement changed in relation to new renewable energy, in relationship to that ring road that goes around Medicine Hat, as well as in relationship to the Trans-Canada Highway. And then lastly, if we see changes in migration patterns, do these changes result in changes to annual and winter survival rates for pronghorn in the Northern Sagebrush Steppe? And what does that mean for populations? So we've initiated the new study, like I mentioned, and we've got sort of four major sort of capture study areas. The first one is what we call Alberta North, so trying to capture animals north of the Trans-Canada Highway in the CFB Suffield and north area. And then animals in our second study, which we call Alberta South, so south of the Trans-Canada Highway and sort of the major native prairie connectivity area for pronghorn. And then again, sort of repeating that on the Saskatchewan side, so capturing animals in Saskatchewan North and Saskatchewan South on either side of the Trans-Canada Highway. So the idea behind it is we'll do 4 years of capturing. We've already done our first year, and I'll show you a map of where we captured. So we did 106 animals this past December, distributed between the 4 study areas. And those collars, for the most part, will hopefully last 4 years. So we'll get 4 years of consecutive data on that animal. We'll put out another minimum 104 collars this coming December and another 104 collars in December of 2026. So we'll have just over 300 animals collared, and data collection will run all the way up to 2029. That's the idea behind the new study, to get sort of long-term movement and migration data on these animals. So this gives you an idea of where we captured this past December. We did 56 animals in Alberta and 50 in Saskatchewan. So basically it was 25 animals in the north, and that's what these blue dots represent, where we captured animals. And then 31 in the south, and then 25 in Saskatchewan North and 25 in Saskatchewan South. And as you can kind of see, we did get sort of a good distribution of animals along both on the south and the north side of the Trans-Canada Highway. And then one of the ways that we're able to assess that sort of fine scale selection and movement along the Trans-Canada and Highway 3 is these collars have a geofence built into them. So basically what we did is we put a 4-kilometer buffer on either side of the Highway 3 and either side of the Trans-Canada Highway. And then when animals move into this buffer, their collar fix rate changes from every 5 hours to every 15 minutes. So we're getting really sort of fine scale temporal and spatial data on where animals are interacting with the Trans-Canada Highway and where animals are either crossing or not crossing the highway. So I kind of just want to bring you back to, this is the map that we produced through Pronghorn Crossing that had our high priority sites. So I just kind of want to bring people to site 5, site 8, site 10, and then 13 and 15. And I'm just going to show you some preliminary data that we've already got from the collars since December, just to kind of show you how pronghorn are interacting with the Trans-Canada. So this is our sort of first animal, pronghorn 252. She was actually captured up in this area here in sort of Alberta, north of the Trans-Canada Highway. And shortly after capture, she moved down to the Trans-Canada Highway at sort of Alberta 5-6 site. That's 6 here, this is 5 here. Was not successful in crossing and ended up moving to the west, crossing Highway 41 and coming into this Dunmore area. And you can see she basically spent the majority of the winter in the Dunmore area. And it looks like the railway tracks, which you see here, was definitely an impediment to her movement. She always butts up against it, but doesn't actually successfully cross. And then at the end of January, I believe it was, she crosses Highway 41 again into this area here. She kind of moves around. This is a gravel pit, and this is a gravel pit. So she's kind of bouncing around the gravel pits, which likely have human high disturbance. Again, gets within vicinity of the Trans-Canada Highway, but does not cross the railroad tracks, and then eventually moves back into the Dunmore area before the spring leaving and then heading north. So she actually never crossed the Trans-Canada Highway. She butted up against it, but never crossed. And this is Pronghorn P85. This is kind of gives you the idea in terms of why I'm amazed at how far of a distance these animals can cross. We kind of called her our OMG Pronghorn. So she was actually collared up here in Saskatchewan, near Haslett, Saskatchewan. And then on December 23rd, this is when she starts this journey in the southwest direction. And she kind of falls down. She never actually gets to the Trans-Canada Highway until she reaches Saskatchewan 10, this area here. And on January 7th, she actually gets across the Trans-Canada Highway and continues moving north and actually moves into Alberta, into that Walsh area. So total distance traveled was over 400 kilometers during this roughly month movement, or 110 kilometers as sort of as the crow flies. And she did have 6 attempts here at the Trans-Canada Highway where she attempted to cross. And I'll just kind of zoom into her. You can sort of see here, she's bouncing off the Trans-Canada Highway, moving back and forth. I suspect along sort of this county road here, there's a fence she couldn't get across, and that's why she moved north before being able to continue her movement west. Looks like she might have hit another fence that sort of forced her back down south, where she hit the Trans-Canada again at our site 10 and then sort of moved over, and this is where she successfully crossed, and then spent a few days trying to get across the railway tracks before successfully crossing. And again, she kind of continues this west movement, bouncing up to the Trans-Canada Highway before she eventually moves into Walsh area, where she actually approached our Alberta 8 site, but never actually crossed again, stayed on the south side, and then has now sort of at the end of winter moved back into Saskatchewan. And then this is another one of our movers. This is P289. We kind of called her the Daredevil if 285 was our OMG gal. So she was captured December 6th, northeast of Tompkins, Alberta, in this area here. And then on December 24th, she moves south and kind of gets to the Tompkins area roughly here, where she does end up crossing the Trans-Canada Highway 3 times, 2 in the north, 2 in the south direction, and once north. So she came across, stayed in this area, then went back across to the north side before eventually coming back. And she actually successfully crossed the highway roughly here, and then sort of navigated the railway tracks and then continued in a westerly direction. And you can sort of see here, she kind of moves down into this area, likely some fences along this county road, which she wasn't successful at navigating. Moved back up, got across the railway tracks again, continued west, sort of trapped between the highway and the railway tracks. Eventually crosses the railway tracks here, walks basically looks like almost parallel right down the road here before getting into this area, and then eventually continues west, passing Saskatchewan 13 potential mitigation site, but not actually crossing, and then ends up in the Piapot area. And unfortunately, P289 is no longer with us. She sort of seemed to get trapped in this area between the highway, the railway tracks, and was one of our mortalities this past winter. And then I kind of just want to zoom back in again and just show some animals in the migration corridor for Alberta, but specifically as it relates to the ring road that goes from Highway 3 to the Trans-Canada Highway around Medicine Hat. And we had 2 animals that were captured together where roughly this red star is. And they were kind of captured together because one of them is sort of our GPS collar for the study. Then the other one is actually a GPS collar that has a built-in video camera, which is going to get us some neat information on via videos on what animals do on a day-to-day basis. But that collar will be falling off in September. So as you can see here, they're fairly close to this west migration corridor. And this is their movement pattern. So this is where the 2 were collared. The blue one is P212, and then the yellow one here is P264. So 264 is the one with the video camera. And then you do see this green line here, which is 263. But for the purpose of this slide, pretend you don't see this one because I'm going to talk about her in the next slide. So basically, the 2 of them kind of hung out together for the most part during the winter time. On December 29th, P12 kind of did a little bit of a north movement by herself, but then came back and joined out with P264. And then sort of what happened is come the springtime, end of February, beginning of March, when we got that warm weather, P12 decided to make a movement. And she moves west, and you can kind of see this is the first part of that movement up this way. She doesn't really get close to that ring road, and she basically doesn't even consider that west migration corridor. She continues all the way across the highway, which is about a 30-kilometer distance, and moves up to the Trans-Canada here, which is actually at our mitigation site 5. She basically gets right up to that site, but for some reason she does not cross. She ends up turning around and moving back sort of south of Dunmore to this area here. And while she's moving south, P264 decides to take a slightly different route across the landscape and moves back up into here. And they actually joined up together for a while in this area here. And since they've actually split, and 212 is over in this area here right now, and 264 is moved down into this area. So they could have actually crossed if they wanted to at that west migration corridor path, but decided to come all the way across country and try up here, but not successfully. So it kind of begs the question, is some of our initial data saying maybe that west corridor is lost and not sure about whether they can actually cross to keep moving north this way, because both animals haven't crossed yet. And then here's P263. So that was the one that...
Paul?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We're running up to the 2:30 end time, so I'm just hoping that maybe you can wrap it up. We can have a little bit of time for a couple questions.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, this is my last slide.
Oh, okay, perfect.
So yeah, so perfect. Yeah, I just kind of want to show her. So she was collared and wintered in the Etsicum area down here, and then kind of moved up late wintered in this area. And then in the spring, sort of at roughly that same time, she does this huge 50K movement. And this is where she joins out with P264 south of Dunmore. And they spent a couple of days together doing selfies because both of these collars have the video cameras. And then for some reason now she's moved south again, 30 kilometers, and is in this area. So it's, yeah, the data we're getting from these collars initially is providing sort of great insights in terms of connectivity for these animals. And then just kind of to acknowledge all of the funding partners that have made the historic work and this current work happen. Then yeah, I'd be happy to take questions.
Well, thanks, Paul. Really informative and super cool work. It's always amazing to see the advancement of telemetry and locating, tracking animals. So I always enjoy seeing that compared to it's always fun to spend time on the tracking different animals, but it definitely get better data and longer term data with the new GeoCollar. So really appreciate that information. Thanks everyone for joining our science seminar today. Our next science seminar will be Tuesday, May 6th, and Dr. Glennis Hood will be presenting on photosynthesis to DNA, multi-method detection of riparian animals. And if you're not on our mailing list and would like to be added, please contact our office at the epa.ocs@gov.ab.ca. And with that, I think we'll end for today. And thanks again, Paul, for sharing this great work with us, and for everyone who's tuned in. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.